Denise Roach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that contribution from the Minister. I think there is still room for this plan to be appealed to the Environment Court, and that is in the bill, and that is where there is the Council decides the Council does not agree with the decision of the hearings panel, or where the hearings panel makes the decision which is outside the scope of the submissions. I would like to say that this bill and how it impacts on the unitary plan for Auckland is basically another classic example of Auckland being discriminated against. And we've seen this time and time again with this government. We've seen it with the Housing Accord, we've seen it with the Land Transport Management Act, we've seen it now with the unitary plan. The hearings panel will be appointed by this government, and I acknowledge the Minister's comments that there will be consultation with the Council, but at the end of the day they will be appointed by the government. In every other council with every other unitary plan, it is the Council that determines those who will hear it. This is Auckland being discriminated against. The hearings panel can make recommendations on issues that are outside the scope of submissions, which is not terribly democratic, given that no one will have commented on those issues that are being raised by them. On the other hand, the bill explicitly prevents the Council from doing the same. They're not allowed to make decisions on evidence that has not been through the hearings panel. So it's pretty clear where the government places its faith. It places its faith in the appointees that they have appointed to hear the Auckland plan. I would also suggest that this government is seeking to undermine local government in Auckland through the recommendations that it's making, and they've actually stated them pretty clearly in the Select Committee report, the recommendations that say that the majority of us, and I'm quoting here, the majority of us recommend that Section 139 makes it clear that the hearing panel must specify where it's making a recommendation outside the scope of submissions, and later on in that same paragraph it says, we recommend amending Section 143 to prohibit the Council in making its decisions from considering new evidence or any other material that was not available to the hearings panel. This is intended to reduce the likelihood of the Council making decisions based on inappropriate political lobbying and ensure that it follows a fair process. Now, this is really interesting. I'll just read it again. It's to reduce, not make decisions based on inappropriate political lobbying. This is the same government that is making a law on the International Convention Centre with a process that was fairly truncated as well.
Order.
I'm coming back to the bill in a second. I was using that as an example, sir, of inappropriate lobbying, the sort that this government seeks to avoid by restricting Auckland Council in their decision making. The hearings panel are able to have extended decision making powers, and my colleague Eugenie Sage spoke about this as well, that the ability for the hearings panel to make decisions on things that may not be included in the submissions basically comes down to them plan making rather than them blurring the division between plan making and interfering. And I think we need to take into account the fact that these panel members will not be appointed by City Council, and they'll be making decisions based on their own judgment. It's not something that happens in other areas when they are considering their own unitary plans. The other area that I wanted to comment on was the fact that this bill does not actually take any real notice of the Auckland Spatial Plan. The Auckland Spatial Plan, the 30-year plan that was developed with huge input from people right across Auckland and enormous effort. Mr Chair, thank you. The Auckland Spatial Plan, which was developed with huge input and actually huge cost as well to Auckland Council, because it was directed to under the Auckland Council Act. That 30-year plan, which actually determines and gives a broad outline of where and how our city should develop over 30 years. Now, under the previous Act, which said that Auckland had to do this, we were given a time frame that was incredibly tight. And at the start of that process, when I was actually a Waiheke local board member, we were told the time frame, and we were also told that in other cities like Vancouver, this took 8 years to get it right. Now, Auckland Council has done an amazing job to deliver, as required by the government, an incredibly useful and sensible plan that we should be giving weight to. We should be having a unitary plan that is consistent with it. What it says in this bill is that they will give regard to it. And I guess that is something that actually, again, undermines the democracy in Auckland. There is one part of this bill that I do agree with, and that is leaving the Hauraki Gulf Islands unitary plan out of it. And yes, of course, I'm slightly biased, being a resident of the Hauraki Gulf. But the Hauraki Gulf Islands actually are in a much better position because we went through a democratic process to get our plan. And it was quite a painful process, I have to admit. There were thousands and thousands of submissions. The hearings took over 2.5 years. And I'd like to acknowledge in this House Mr. Ray Erickson, who was on that hearings panel, but he was the chair of our community board and then our local board. He was an elected representative hearing from his community what the issues were and how we wanted to develop our island communities for the future. It strikes me as incredibly unfair that Auckland, this new super city that was created by this government through its legislation, requiring it to jump through so many hoops, that the people of Auckland do not get the same access to democracy. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to take a short call on the part 2 of the legislation.